South Africa has a fascinating rail network that mostly uses the same 3-foot 6-inch gauge track as New Zealand, but my country never had anything as impressive as Garretts that actually worked, or as insane as big 484 tender engines with condensing equipment in the tender. In any case, we have a trio of payware South African routes in Train Simulator Classic, all made by the same two people. Today, we're looking at the longest route these developers have made so far, namely Worcester to Mossel Bay. And to be absolutely crystal clear, although I have a low opinion of this route, that does not mean this video was made just so I could have a go at the developers behind it. That is not why I review Train Simulator or Train Sim World add-ons. The Worcester to Mossel Bay add-on is younger than it looks, having been released in February 2020, and it costs 37 New Zealand dollars at full price. It was made by the same guys behind the Pietermaritzburg to Ladysmith and George to Knysna routes, but the quality of all three add-ons leaves a lot to be desired. Incidentally, I have previously reviewed the other two routes, and I'll include links to both of them in the description for anyone who's interested. The Pietermaritzburg to Ladysmith review happened to be made right around the time when the add-on turned 10 years old. Thinking back to the Worcester to Mossel Bay line, it's a staggering 320 kilometres, or 199 miles long, certainly far too long to complete a full-length trip in one sitting. But if you were sufficiently determined to attempt the full run from Worcester to Mossel Bay, that would take you at least 4 hours and 20 minutes to complete. Meanwhile, there is a manual available for this route, and it goes into a lot of detail about the history of this line. As for what specific time period the in-game route is set in, I have no idea. As is the case with the two previous payware South African routes, Worcester to Mossel Bay only includes one form of motive power. In this case, it's a diesel locomotive that I refer to as the Class 37/30s. These two liveries, with blue and orange, are the only ones you get for this locomotive. And I think they're meant to be Spornet liveries, just without the branding. As for what the Class 37/30s even is, she's a variant of the EMD GT26 series, and looks very similar to KiwiRail's DFT class, although most of those engines are now designated as DFB. For comparison, here's a shot of DFB 7145, recorded at Hamilton's Frankton Station in December 2024. 100 examples of this class were built by General Motors South Africa of Port Elizabeth, entering service in 1981 and 1982. Apparently, they were the last diesel locomotives ordered by the National Railway Company until 2009. As of 2018, the whole class is still in service, except for one example rebuilt as a Class 39/30s. Frankly, I think this rendition of the Class 37/30s for TS is very poorly made, to the point where I consider it to be one of the worst diesels in the game. For starters, this thing reminds me of Hornby's model of the LNER Thompson Pacifics, in the sense that the colours are very washed out. Under certain lighting, the orange livery looks more like salmon pink to me. This locomotive's situation isn't helped by the rubbish sounds. For starters, whenever you blast the horn, you can also hear the sound of another prime mover in the background, on top of the locomotive's normal prime mover sounds, of which I am not a fan either. The prime mover you can hear on the horn audio is more noticeable when the engine is shut down. The Class 37/30's poor quality is the main reason why I hardly ever use this route. That and the fact that, aside from the 24 Class 284, there are no other South African engines in TS that can run on this route. As if the prime mover sounds weren't bad enough in the external view, they're even worse in the cab. This thing doesn't have a notched throttle, although this may be realistic for all I know. While making this review, I realised that the locomotive doesn't even have working instrument lights, and the normal keyboard control for the cab light doesn't work, for whatever reason. To be fair, I think the unpowered rolling stock included with this route is reasonably well modelled, and they're a welcome improvement over what we've seen in the previous South African routes, especially the H6 coach from Pietermaritzburg to Ladysmith. In the case of Worcester to Mossel Bay, you get the C16 and C27 passenger coaches, A18 dining coach, K42 luggage van, a steam heat van of some kind, then the DJ2 open gondola, and FZ6 maze wagon. That selection is not too big in the grand scheme of things, but it still does the job. As for why the steam heat wagon is included, the manual says that these things were used whenever diesel locomotives needed to haul passenger trains in the winter months, as the diesels themselves don't have any train heating equipment on board. Driving on this route can be quite difficult due to the numerous steep inclines, where you have to constantly keep an eye on the brakes so as not to break the speed limit. The steepest grade I noticed on this route was around 1 in 20. Technically, only 3 scenarios are included with this route, but 2 of them are split into 4 parts each. I've only ever bothered playing one of the scenarios myself, that being the short run from Outeniqua to Mossel Bay, because the others were all too long for my liking. Incidentally, I've never driven over every section of this route, but quite frankly, I think I've seen enough of it to form a solid opinion. Thinking back to that run from Outeniqua to Mossel Bay, I thought it was rather boring because, for almost the entire run, you have to crawl along under a speed limit of only 30 km per hour. The highest permitted speed I recall seeing anywhere on this route is only 60 km per hour. There are numerous Choo Tjoe era assets dotted about throughout the route, with the custom assets seemingly being harder to spot by comparison. However, one area where you certainly can't miss the custom assets is this big shopping centre between Outeniqua and Mossel Bay. Nearer to the end of the line, as opposed to nearer to Tweeter and the Monkey Man, you'll pass these blue coaches on a siding. In real life, they're used as accommodation and branded as the Santos Express Train Lodge, but I noticed that the model in TS is clearly just a modified version of the H6 from the Pietermaritzburg route, complete with a stupidly low-resolution logo to boot. As for the railway track itself, it suffers from the same problem as KwaZulu-Natal corridor, in the sense that the ballast texture doesn't match the ground textures at all. In my opinion, this often spoils the route's appearance, especially in the area surrounding Robertson Station. Quite frankly, I can't believe this route was released as recently as 2020. It looks more like a freeware route from the early 2010s. It's disappointing to see little to no improvement on the overall scenery quality from these developers' 2 previous routes. You could argue that the route coverage being as long as 320 kilometers meant the developers had to compromise in some places, and that may be the case for all I know, but based on what I've seen in my time on this route, anyone would think the developers didn't even try to do a good job on the scenery. I thought the scenery was particularly bad in the Worcester area. For one thing, there's a few places where you can easily see the details ending not too far beyond the track. And for another, there's 2 large plots of land right next to the track that just look hideously barren. Meanwhile, over at Hartenbos, near the eastern end of the route, the scenery doesn't look too much better than Worcester, especially when there's this one building asset copied and pasted several times over. On the plus side, and at least on my end, the route runs at very high frame rates without much lag. But in some cases, it is still possible to have good-looking scenery that doesn't tank the frames too much. Case in point, the West of England main line by Golden Age developments. If I could give any advice to the developers behind these 3 South African routes, it would be to take notes from the Midland Line Springfield to Aikens route. For the most part, this is an example of how 3-foot 6-inch gauge routes can be done right, with its wide variety of custom assets, good ambient sounds, and high-quality rolling stock, although the experience is let down by the excessive amount of 3D trees used as distant scenery, which results in wildly inconsistent frame rates and frequent lag. And don't get me started on the annoying advanced brakes with which the DJ and EO locomotives are equipped. Some of my issues with the Midland line aside, here's a brief comparison between DJ 3580 and the Class 37/30s. The New Zealand engines, that's the DJ and Diesel Workshops DA in this case, could set an example for how to do 3-foot 6-inch gauge diesels well, although I would prefer it if any future additions to this category do not have advanced brakes. At the end of the day, I can only give the Worcester to Mossel Bay route a 3.5 out of 10. I mean, sure, it's nice to get a narrow gauge route that's also set in a country far away from the usual UK, US and Germany trio, but that shouldn't excuse the poor quality of the scenery and especially the included diesel locomotive. Although my take on Worcester to Mossel Bay was, admittedly, harsher than normal, I still hope that, if these developers ever make another South African route for TS, it'll finally be good.